The autumn breeze rustled through the trees of Central Park as Marcus Johnson adjusted the settings on his Canon camera. At 15, he was already showing remarkable talent in photography, earning him top grades in his high school art class. This sunny Saturday morning was perfect for capturing the images he needed for his final project. Marcus had woken up early, excited about the photography session ahead. His mother, Mayor Sophia Johnson, had reminded him to keep his student ID card handy and his phone fully charged, precautions that had become routine for them. Better safe than sorry, she always said, a phrase that carried extra weight given their experiences as one of the few black families in this upscale neighborhood. Dressed in neat jeans and his favorite Howard University hoodie, a gift from his mom's alma mater, Marcus looked every bit the serious student photographer. He had spent the last hour capturing stunning shots of blue jays and cardinals near the park's entrance, documenting their morning routines for his project theme, urban nature, life in Central Park. The morning light was hitting the Victorian-style houses along Park Avenue perfectly, creating beautiful shadows that would make for excellent architectural shots. Marcus knew these houses well. He had grown up in this neighborhood, watching it change and develop over the years. Some of the residents knew him as the mayor's son, while others simply saw him as another local kid. As he focused his lens on a particularly striking bay window, Marcus didn't notice Karen Matthews watching him from behind her living room curtains. Karen, a relatively new resident who had moved to the area 6 months ago, had been observing him for the past 10 minutes with growing suspicion. Karen was known in the neighborhood for her active participation in the local Facebook community group, where she frequently posted about suspicious activities, which often turned out to be nothing more than delivery people doing their jobs or kids playing in the street. She prided herself on being vigilant, though others might have used different words to describe her behavior. Marcus continued his photography, completely absorbed in his work. He checked his camera's display, reviewing the shots he had taken. His art teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, had encouraged him to explore different angles and perspectives, advice he was taking seriously. He moved closer to get a better shot of the ornate architecture, unaware that his presence was causing concern. Inside her house, Karen Matthews was becoming increasingly agitated. She didn't recognize Marcus, despite him having lived in the neighborhood for years. All she saw was a young black teenager taking pictures of houses, and in her mind, this could only mean one thing: trouble. The irony of the situation was striking. Just the previous evening, Marcus had been at the dinner table with his mother, discussing his photography project. Mayor Johnson had been excited about his choice of subject matter, seeing it as a way to showcase the beauty of their community. She had even suggested some spots in the park where he might find interesting subjects to photograph. As Marcus adjusted his camera's aperture settings, trying to capture the perfect amount of light, Karen Matthews made her decision. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling slightly with what she believed was justified concern. In her mind, she was doing her civic duty, protecting her neighborhood from what she perceived as a threat. The morning was still peaceful in Central Park. Birds chirped their morning songs, joggers passed by with friendly waves, and dog walkers exchanged pleasant greetings. Marcus checked his watch. It was just past 9:30 a.m. He planned to spend another hour photographing before heading home to review his work. Little did he know that his peaceful morning of photography was about to turn into something entirely different. Karen Matthews had already dialed the first 2 digits of 911, her eyes fixed on Marcus through her window. She watched as he took another photo, his movements careful and deliberate, completely unaware of the drama that was about to unfold. The sun continued to rise higher in the sky, casting longer shadows across the park's well-maintained paths. It was shaping up to be a beautiful day in the neighborhood, at least for a few more minutes. The events that would follow would not only change Marcus' morning, but would also spark a conversation that this community desperately needed to have. Karen Matthews stepped out of her house with determined steps, her phone clutched tightly in her right hand. She was wearing her typical weekend attire: designer yoga pants and an expensive fleece jacket, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. The confidence in her walk showed that she had done this before, confronting people she deemed suspicious in her neighborhood. Marcus was still focused on his photography when he heard the sharp clicking of footsteps approaching him. Before he could turn around, a loud voice broke his concentration. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Karen's voice was sharp and demanding, carrying across the morning air like a whip crack. Several nearby birds scattered at the sudden noise, ruining the shot Marcus had been trying to capture. Marcus lowered his camera slowly, his heart beginning to race. This was exactly the type of situation his parents had prepared him for. Stay calm, he reminded himself. Be polite, but stand your ground. He turned to face Karen, making sure to keep a respectful distance. Good morning, ma'am, Marcus replied in a clear, steady voice. I'm working on my photography project for school. I'm capturing images of our neighborhood's architecture and wildlife. He reached for his student ID, which was hanging around his neck on a lanyard. Karen's eyes narrowed, deliberately ignoring the ID card. I've been watching you for the past 15 minutes. You've been taking pictures of people's houses. That's suspicious behavior, and I have every right to question it. Her voice grew louder with each word, attracting attention from morning joggers and dog walkers. Marcus took a deep breath, just as his mother had taught him. I understand your concern, ma'am, but I'm just a student. This is my neighborhood, too. Here's my school ID. He tried again to show her the identification, but Karen took a step back as if the card might bite her. Don't try to fool me, Karen interrupted, her face reddening. I know what casing houses looks like. I watch true crime shows. You're probably taking pictures to plan break-ins later. She held up her phone, making sure Marcus could see it. I've already started dialing 911, and I won't hesitate to press that last digit. A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance, some people quietly recording the interaction on their phones. An elderly man walking his dog shook his head in disapproval, not at Marcus, but at Karen's behavior. He recognized the mayor's son but remained silent, knowing this scene needed to play out. Marcus felt his hands starting to shake slightly, but his voice remained steady. Ma'am, I live here. My mom is. He started to explain, but Karen cut him off again. Oh, sure you do, she scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And I suppose next you'll tell me you know the mayor personally. She let out a short, harsh laugh, unaware of just how ironic her statement was. Marcus reached for his phone, knowing it was time to call his mother. As he did so, Karen's eyes widened with alarm. Don't you dare reach for anything, she shouted, finally pressing that last digit on her phone. Yes, hello, 911. I need to report the suspicious person. Two more neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion. One of them, Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus's art teacher who lived 3 houses down, immediately recognized what was happening. She started walking toward them, her Sunday newspaper still in hand. But before Mrs. Rodriguez could reach them, Karen was already giving the police dispatcher a detailed description. Yes, there's a young black male, probably around 16, taking pictures of houses. He's wearing a Howard University hoodie, and he's refusing to leave when confronted. No, he can't prove he lives here. Yes, I feel threatened. Marcus had managed to dial his mother's number while Karen was talking to the dispatcher. His hands were steady now. This wasn't his first experience with prejudice, and he knew exactly what to do. He started recording the interaction on his phone, just as his parents had practiced with him countless times. The morning sun continued to shine brightly, oblivious to the tension unfolding below. What had started as a peaceful photography session had evolved into yet another example of the everyday challenges faced by young black Americans, even in their own neighborhoods. The dispatcher's voice crackled through Karen's phone speaker, clear enough for Marcus to hear. Ma'am, can you confirm if this person has actually done anything threatening? The question seemed to fuel Karen's determination even more. He's taking pictures of people's houses. Karen practically shouted into her phone. In this neighborhood, he doesn't belong here. She paced back and forth, her free hand gesturing wildly. Several more neighbors had gathered, creating an uncomfortable circle around the scene. Meanwhile, Marcus had his mother on his phone. Mom, he said calmly, though his heart was racing. I'm at the park near Thompson Street, taking pictures for my project. There's a woman here who's called the police because... He paused, taking a deep breath. Because she thinks I'm suspicious. Mayor Sophia Johnson was in the middle of reviewing city budget proposals when she received her son's call. The moment she heard his voice, she knew something was wrong. Years of dealing with similar situations, both as a mother and as a public figure, had taught her to recognize the subtle tension in her son's voice. Keep your camera recording, Marcus, Mayor Johnson instructed, already grabbing her car keys and signaling to her weekend assistant. I'm on my way. Don't move, stay calm, and remember everything we practiced." The sound of her office door closing could be heard through the phone. Karen was still speaking animatedly to the dispatcher, her voice growing more frustrated. "No, you don't understand. He's got 2 phones now. He could be signaling to accomplices." She had noticed Marcus's call to his mother and had completely misinterpreted it. Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus's art teacher, had finally reached them. "Karen, stop this right now," she said firmly. "This is Marcus. He's my student, and he's doing a photography assignment that I gave his class." She moved to stand near Marcus, her presence providing a small measure of comfort. But Karen wasn't having it. "Stay out of this," she snapped at Mrs. Rodriguez. "You could be part of it for all I know. The police are already on their way, and they'll sort this out." Her hand trembled as she pointed accusingly at Marcus, who continued recording steadily. The dispatcher's voice came through again. "Ma'am, we have units responding, but I need you to maintain a safe distance from the individual and stop engaging if you feel threatened." The professional tone carried a hint of skepticism that Karen completely missed. Marcus could hear his mother's car starting through his phone. Mayor Johnson was speaking to someone else, probably her security detail, while keeping the line open with her son. 3 minutes, Marcus," she said firmly. "I'm 3 minutes away." More neighbors had gathered, and the scene had taken on an almost theatrical quality. Some were filming, others were whispering among themselves, and a few were openly showing their disapproval of Karen's behavior. The morning sun now felt uncomfortably warm on everyone's faces. Through his phone, Marcus could hear the familiar sound of his mother's city-issued SUV's engine revving. He knew she was taking the shortcuts only longtime residents knew about. The sound was oddly comforting amid the chaos. Karen was now pacing in circles, still on the phone with dispatch. "They're all gathering now," she said, her voice rising with each word. "There's a crowd forming. This is exactly what I was worried about." The irony that she had caused the very gathering she was now complaining about seemed lost on her. In the distance, the first sounds of police sirens could be heard. Marcus stood his ground, just as his parents had taught him. His camera hung around his neck, the memory card now containing not just beautiful morning photos, but also evidence of how quickly a peaceful morning could turn hostile. Mrs. Rodriguez had positioned herself between Marcus and Karen, speaking calmly to the gathering crowd, explaining the situation. Some of the older residents were shaking their heads, having seen similar scenes play out in other neighborhoods on the news, never thinking it would happen in their own backyard. The sirens were getting closer now, and Marcus could hear his mother say through the phone, "I'm turning onto Thompson Street now, baby. Stay calm. Everything's going to be fine." Her voice carried the weight of experience, both personal and professional, in handling such situations. The morning had transformed from a peaceful photography session into a scene that would soon make local headlines, though not for the reasons Karen had imagined. As both police cruisers and the mayor's SUV approached from different directions, no one in the growing crowd could have predicted exactly how this confrontation would end. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the scene first, their lights flashing against the morning sun. Officers Mike Chen and Sarah Rodriguez stepped out, immediately taking in the unusual crowd gathered around the park. They'd been briefed about a suspicious person, but the scene before them told a different story. Just as Officer Chen was about to speak, a black SUV with city government plates squealed around the corner. It came to a precise stop behind the police cruisers, its official mayoral flag fluttering in the breeze. Karen Matthews, still clutching her phone, watched with growing confusion as the vehicle's door opened. Mayor Sophia Johnson emerged from the SUV, every inch the powerful city official in her weekend business casual attire. Her face was composed, but those who knew her well could see the controlled anger in her eyes. Her security detail, dressed in plain clothes, quickly surveyed the scene from their following vehicle. "Mom," Marcus called out, his voice steady but relieved. Karen's jaw dropped, her phone nearly slipping from her suddenly loose grip. The word "Mom" seemed to echo across the now silent gathering, and several neighbors couldn't hide their satisfied smiles. That's Mayor Johnson," Karen stammered, her face draining of color. The 911 dispatcher was still on the line, asking if she needed assistance, but Karen had forgotten all about the call. Her hand slowly lowered, and the phone clicked off. Mayor Johnson walked purposefully toward the group, her heels clicking against the sidewalk. She'd made similar walks countless times, to City Hall, to community meetings, to press conferences, but this one was different. This one was personal. "Good morning, officers," Mayor Johnson said professionally, nodding to Chen and Rodriguez. "I see you've responded to a call about my son's photography project." Her voice was calm, but carried an authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. Officers Chen and Rodriguez exchanged knowing looks. They'd worked in the city long enough to respect Mayor Johnson's leadership style, firm but fair, especially in situations like this. "Yes, Madam Mayor," Officer Rodriguez replied. "We received a call about suspicious activity." Karen Matthews stood frozen, her face cycling through various shades of red and white. The same woman she'd seen on local news, leading city council meetings and cutting ribbons at new community centers, was standing before her as the mother of the young man she'd just reported to police. "Mrs. Matthews, I presume?" Mayor Johnson turned to face Karen, her voice maintaining its professional tone. "I believe you've already met my son, Marcus. He's a junior at Franklin High School, and as his art teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez here, can confirm he's working on his photography final project." The gathered crowd had grown larger, with more neighbors joining to witness the scene. Phones were recording, and a few people were already posting to local community groups, the same groups where Karen had often posted her suspicious activity reports. Mrs. Rodriguez, the art teacher, stepped forward with Marcus's project brief in hand. "I have the assignment details right here, Mayor Johnson. Marcus was following the project guidelines exactly as instructed." She shot a disappointed look at Karen, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. Officer Chen, assessing the situation with experienced eyes, holstered his untouched weapon and pulled out his notepad instead. "Ma'am," he addressed Karen, "making false reports to emergency services is a serious offense. Would you like to explain why you felt it necessary to call 911? Mayor Johnson raised her hand slightly, a gesture familiar to anyone who'd attended city council meetings. Before Mrs. Matthews responds, I want to be clear about something. She looked around the gathered crowd, making eye contact with several neighbors. This incident represents exactly why our community needs to have some serious discussions about bias and prejudice. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the park. Karen Matthews, the woman who had been so confident in her accusations just minutes ago, now looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. Her designer yoga pants and expensive fleece jacket suddenly felt like a costume she'd been caught wearing. Marcus stood tall beside his mother, his camera still hanging around his neck, his phone still recording. The morning's photography project had captured something far more significant than architecture and wildlife. It had documented a moment of confrontation between prejudice and power, ignorance and authority, fear and family. Mayor Sophia Johnson stood in the morning sunlight, her presence commanding the attention of everyone gathered around. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, but the mayor had handled countless difficult situations during her career. This one, however, was different. It was about her son. "Officers," she began, pulling out a leather portfolio from her bag, "I have here Marcus's complete photography assignment documentation, signed by both his teacher and his school principal." She handed the papers to Officer Chen, who began reviewing them carefully. "But what I'd really like to address is the larger issue at hand." Karen Matthews shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The same neighbors who usually liked her security alerts on social media were now watching her with disapproval. Some had their phones out, still recording the scene. "Mrs. Matthews," Mayor Johnson continued, turning to face Karen directly, "my son has lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. That's 3 years longer than you've been here." Her voice remained professional, but there was an edge to it that made Karen flinch. "He was born in this city, grew up in that house right there, and has every right to be here." Officer Rodriguez, who had been taking notes, looked up. "Mayor Johnson, would you like to press charges for false reporting?" The question hung in the air, making Karen's face turn an even paler shade of white. The mayor glanced at Marcus, who had maintained his composure throughout the entire incident. He gave his mother a subtle nod, something that didn't go unnoticed by the gathering. Their silent communication spoke volumes about their relationship and how they'd handled similar situations before. "No, Officer Rodriguez, Mayor Johnson replied after a moment. I don't think pressing charges will solve the real problem here. She turned to address the crowd, naturally falling into her role as both a leader and an educator. What we need is understanding, not punishment. Mrs. Rodriguez, the art teacher, stepped forward with another set of papers. I have here Marcus's previous photography works, she said, displaying several award-winning photographs. He won the state youth photography competition last year. These are the same streets, the same houses he was photographing today. Karen's eyes widened as she looked at the photographs. They were beautiful captures of their neighborhood. The same buildings she had accused Marcus of casing were transformed into art through his lens. The irony was not lost on anyone present. I didn't know, Karen stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I just thought. She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence without making herself sound worse. That's exactly the problem, Mrs. Matthews, Mayor Johnson said firmly. You didn't know, but you assumed. You didn't ask, but you accused. You didn't consider that a young black man might actually belong in this neighborhood, might actually have talent, might actually be doing exactly what he said he was doing. Officer Chen closed his notebook and exchanged a look with his partner. Ma'am, he addressed Karen, while no charges are being filed, we do need to have a serious discussion about the appropriate use of emergency services. False reports tie up resources that might be needed for real emergencies. The crowd had grown quieter, many people nodding in agreement with both the mayor's words and the officer's statement. Several of Karen's regular social media supporters looked embarrassed, perhaps recognizing their own biases in her actions. What I propose, Mayor Johnson continued, addressing everyone present, is that we use this incident as a catalyst for change. Next week, I'm hosting a community meeting at City Hall about racial profiling and community safety. Mrs. Matthews, I personally invite you to attend. Marcus, who had remained quiet throughout the resolution, finally spoke up. Mom, may I say something? When she nodded, he turned to Karen. Mrs. Matthews, would you like to see the photos I took this morning? Maybe if you understand what I see through my lens, you'll understand why I was here. The simple offer, coming from the young man she had just reported to the police, seemed to break something in Karen. Tears welled up in her eyes as the full impact of her actions hit her. The morning's events had exposed not just her prejudices, but those lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly progressive neighborhood. The sun was now high in the sky, casting no shadows to hide behind. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into a moment of potential learning and growth. Exactly the kind of change Mayor Johnson had been fighting for throughout her career. The morning had grown warmer as Officers Chen and Rodriguez took Karen Matthews aside for what would become one of the most important conversations of her life. They moved to a nearby park bench, away from the watchful eyes of the crowd that was still lingering around the scene. Mrs. Matthews, Officer Chen began, his voice firm but professional. Do you understand why your actions today were problematic? He sat down beside her, while Officer Rodriguez remained standing, her notepad open but pen still. Karen's hands were trembling slightly as she clutched her designer handbag. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood, she whispered, but her voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. Even to her own ears, the excuse sounded hollow. Let's talk about what protection really means, Officer Rodriguez interjected. Last month, our department responded to 127 calls about suspicious persons. Do you know how many of those were actual crimes in progress? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. Karen shook her head, her previously perfectly styled ponytail now slightly disheveled. No, I don't, she admitted quietly. 3. Officer Chen stated flatly. 3 actual crimes. The other 124 calls? They were mostly people of color simply going about their daily lives, delivering packages, jogging, taking photos like Marcus, or just walking in their own neighborhoods. Nearby, Mayor Johnson was speaking with other residents who had gathered, turning this incident into an impromptu community meeting. Her voice carried across the park as she discussed the importance of recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. Each false call, Officer Rodriguez continued, takes resources away from real emergencies. While we were responding to your call about a teenager doing his homework, we could have been helping someone in actual danger. The realization seemed to hit Karen like a physical force. Her shoulders slumped as she looked across the park at Marcus, who was showing his photography portfolio to some interested neighbors. The same young man she had assumed was a criminal was now being praised for his artistic talent. "I never thought," Karen started, then stopped, tears forming in her eyes. "I didn't realize I was being—" She struggled to say the word racist, the reality of her actions finally sinking in. "Prejudiced," Officer Chen finished for her. "The first step to solving a problem is acknowledging it exists. Today could be that first step for you, Mrs. Matthews." Officer Rodriguez pulled out some pamphlets from her patrol car. "These are from our Community Relations Department. They include information about bias training, community engagement programs, and statistics about false reporting. I strongly encourage you to read them." Karen accepted the pamphlets with shaking hands, noticing titles like Understanding Implicit Bias and Building a Safer Community Through Trust. The colorful papers felt heavy with significance in her hands. Meanwhile, Marcus had set up his camera on a tripod and was showing Mrs. Rodriguez and some other neighbors the morning's photos. His artistic eye had captured the neighborhood in ways that made even familiar scenes look fresh and beautiful. "One more thing," Officer Chen added, his tone serious. "While Mayor Johnson chose not to press charges today, making false reports to police is a crime. It can result in fines and even jail time. More importantly, it can put innocent people's lives at risk." Karen nodded, wiping tears from her eyes with an expensive silk sleeve. The weight of her actions, the potential consequences, and the reality of her prejudices were finally hitting home. The mayor's community meeting next week, Officer Rodriguez suggested, would be a good place to start making amends. Not just with Marcus and his family, but with the entire community you've impacted with your actions. As they concluded their conversation, the morning sun had reached its peak. The shadows had disappeared, much like the assumptions and prejudices that had been exposed that day. Karen Matthews sat on the bench, clutching her pamphlets, watching as Marcus continued his photography session, this time with an appreciative audience. The learning moment wasn't just for Karen, it was for everyone who had witnessed the incident. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable situations. A week after the incident, Central Park Community Center buzzed with activity. The large meeting hall, usually reserved for local events and bake sales, was packed to capacity. Mayor Johnson had organized this community forum, but what unfolded was far bigger than anyone had expected. More than 300 residents filled the seats, with others standing along the walls. Local news cameras lined the back of the room, their red lights blinking silently. The crowd was diverse, something rarely seen at previous community meetings. Marcus sat in the front row, his camera ready to document this historic gathering. His photo series about the incident, titled A Lens of Truth, was displayed on large panels at the entrance. The images told a powerful story, from the morning's confrontation to the community's awakening. Karen Matthews arrived early, choosing a seat near the middle. She looked different now, humbled but determined. The past week had been difficult for her. She'd received hate mail, lost friends, and even considered moving. But she had also done something unexpected. She'd started listening and learning. Mayor Johnson approached the podium, the room falling silent as she adjusted the microphone. "1 week ago," she began, "our community made national headlines for the wrong reasons. Today, we're here to ensure we make headlines for the right ones." The mayor introduced the evening's first speaker, Dr. James Thompson, a respected sociologist from the local university. "Racial profiling isn't just about dramatic incidents," he explained. "It's about the small assumptions we make every day, the unconscious biases we don't even realize we carry." As Dr. Thompson spoke, phones around the room lit up. The hashtag Central Park Change was trending locally, with residents live tweeting the event. The conversation was extending far beyond the community center's walls. Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus's art teacher, presented next. She unveiled a new school program called Through Different Lenses, inspired by Marcus's photography. "Art has the power to change perspectives," she explained. "Sometimes we need to see through someone else's eyes to understand their reality." The most powerful moment came when Karen Matthews, surprising everyone, asked to speak. Her hands trembled as she walked to the podium, but her voice was steady. "I was wrong," she began simply. "My actions weren't about safety. They were about prejudice. "I'm here to learn, to change, and to make amends." Marcus captured the moment with his camera. Karen's brave admission, the supportive nods from some audience members, the tears in others' eyes. His photo would later win a national award, titled "The Moment Change Began." Officer Chen presented statistics that shocked many residents. In the past year, our department received over 500 calls about suspicious persons. Nearly 80% of these calls targeted people of color. Less than 1% involved actual criminal activity. The community responded with action. A new neighborhood watch program was established, with mandatory anti-bias training. Local businesses pledged to create more inclusive hiring practices. The high school announced a scholarship program for students pursuing social justice through arts. Social media played its part too. The same community Facebook group that once hosted Karen's suspicious activity reports now shared positive stories about neighborhood diversity. Residents posted photos of themselves getting to know neighbors they previously avoided. A young black business owner stood up during the open discussion. "For years, I've had people cross the street when they see me coming," he shared. "Maybe now, they'll cross the street to say hello instead." His words brought both laughter and reflection. The meeting ran well over its scheduled time. Nobody seemed to mind. People who had lived as strangers for years were finally talking, sharing, and planning together. Email lists were exchanged, committees were formed, and real connections were made. As the evening wound down, Mayor Johnson made one final announcement. "This isn't the end," she declared. "This is just the beginning of our work together. Change doesn't happen in one meeting. It happens in our daily choices and actions." Marcus's final photo of the night captured the scene perfectly. Karen and Mayor Johnson standing together, looking at one of his photographs, engaged in genuine conversation. Behind them, groups of residents lingered, talking animatedly about plans for change. The image would become symbolic of what the community learned that week, that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes if people are willing to learn, grow, and work together for something better. 6 months after the incident that changed their community, Marcus Johnson stood in the city's most prestigious art gallery, surrounded by his photography exhibition Through Different Eyes, a journey of change. The walls displayed his work chronologically, starting with the photos from that fateful morning in Central Park. The opening night crowd was impressive. City council members, community leaders, and even a few state representatives mingled with local residents. Mayor Sophia Johnson watched proudly as her son guided visitors through his exhibition, explaining the story behind each photograph. This first series, Marcus explained to a group of visitors, shows how a regular morning of photography turned into something much bigger. The images captured everything: Karen Matthews' confrontation, the arrival of the police, and his mother's powerful intervention. But it was the later photos that told the real story of change. Karen Matthews herself was there, looking markedly different from the woman in those first photographs. She now served as the co-chair of the neighborhood's newly formed Community Bridge program, working alongside Marcus to educate other communities about confronting and overcoming racial bias. 6 months ago, I was the problem, Karen admitted to a reporter from the national news network covering the exhibition. Today, I'm part of the solution. She gestured to a photograph of herself speaking at a local school, sharing her story with students. It's not easy being known as that woman who called the cops, but it's important to own our mistakes and learn from them. The exhibition featured a special section called The Change Makers, highlighting community members who had turned the incident into an opportunity for growth. Officer Chen and Rodriguez appeared in several photos, conducting workshops on community policing. Mrs. Rodriguez beamed at images of her new photography program that paired students from different backgrounds. A large screen displayed impressive statistics. Suspicious person calls in the neighborhood had dropped by 85%. Community event participation had tripled. The local high school reported a 90% decrease in racial incident reports. Small changes had led to big results. Marcus's photography had gained national recognition. Universities were offering him scholarships, and civil rights organizations wanted to feature his work. But he remained focused on his community. Success isn't just about recognition, he told a group of young photographers. It's about making a real difference. Mayor Johnson had implemented new citywide policies inspired by the incident. Police officers now received enhanced training in bias recognition. Community engagement programs have been strengthened. Other cities were beginning to adopt what they called the Central Park model of community transformation. The most powerful display was the then and now wall. It showed paired photographs. Karen calling the police that morning and now working with community youth. The suspicious neighbors who had gathered that day now actively participating in community programs. The park where it all happened, now hosting regular multicultural events. The real success story, Marcus explained to a documentary filmmaker, isn't just about what changed in our community. It's about showing other communities that change is possible. His words were being recorded for a documentary about community transformation. Near the exhibition's end, a special photograph drew constant attention. It showed Karen and Marcus together at a recent community event, both laughing as they taught photography to local kids. The caption read, "Growth comes in unexpected ways when we open our hearts to change." The evening concluded with an announcement from Mayor Johnson. The City Council had approved funding for a permanent community center focused on arts and cultural understanding. Marcus's photographs would be permanently displayed there, serving as a reminder of how far they'd come. As the crowd began to thin, Karen approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping me see the world through a different lens." Marcus raised his camera and captured the moment, one more image for his ongoing chronicle of change. The last photograph in the exhibition showed sunrise over Central Park, taken exactly 6 months after the incident. It was the same view, the same park, but somehow everything looked different. The caption beneath it read, "Sometimes it takes a moment of darkness to help us see the light." As the gallery lights dimmed on opening night, Marcus stood with his mother, both looking at that final photograph. What had started as a frightening confrontation had transformed into a powerful story of community, growth, and change, all captured through the lens of a young photographer who had turned a moment of prejudice into a movement of progress.